The Single Era Diaries Rebooted. We're back. I did not think I would be doing this podcast again. I thought I was going to be off the market now for good because as unexpected and out of nowhere that it was, because I was definitely not looking to get into another relationship at all. Fate, destiny, the universe played its hand and I thought I had finally met the one. And yet it turns out that somehow I am still not enough, or maybe just too much. So let's unpack the hellscape of dating and relationships in the single era. Join me for the Single Era Diaries Rebooted with me, Jade Graham. We're back, mates. We're back. Besties, mates, wherever you are and wherever you're listening. We're back for another episode of the Single Era Diaries Rebooted podcast. And for this week's episode, it is just me. And I'm going to be deep diving into a topic that I figure will play a fairly big part in most people's dating and relationship life, but it definitely has in mine. And that's the journey of how our childhood wounds shape our dating and our relationship life. And this has really been... The exploration of this has been a really significant part of my personal journey and my healing process, not only towards dating and relationships, but in fact towards my entire life. And having spent a number of years over, pretty much since I had my daughter actually, so my daughter's 7, so the last 7 years, really digging into the psychology, the shadow work, understanding self, seeking to get to grips with all of the parts of me that have contributed in positive ways, but also contribute in negative ways. And I'll be digging into today how those things for all of us can show up in dating and relationships and how that's shaping the fabric of our lives. And this isn't just theory. This is very much lived experience, as I'm sure it will be for most that are listening. And getting to know ourselves in the context of being a single person, which is what I'm doing right now, or getting to know ourselves in relationship or trying to get into a relationship, it's all equally as valuable. So I'm actively doing the work to unpack all of that shadow self that can and does very often show up to sabotage my ability to think clearly, to feel clearly, to hold space for myself. And that's not only in romantic relationships, that's also in career, it's in the work that I do, it's in parenting, it's in friendships, it's in even those associate kind of relationships that I have with just people in the world. These things, they show up for us personally and professionally in everything that we do. And I think it's Carl Jung who made that quote around, if we don't get to know our shadow self, it will show up in our life and we'll call it fate. So if you're anything like me and you grew up in a challenging family environment, I would go as far as describing the family environment that I grew up in as being quite toxic, abusive at times, a very challenging home environment to come up in, then you might find that if you had any of those similar scenarios, that your relationship patterns could perhaps bear some similarities to my own. I found myself constantly seeking refuge in relationships, and I want to explore why that happens and how those early experiences can influence the adult relationships that we go on to have. And to give you some background, if you haven't listened to the first seasons of the Single Era Diaries before we rebooted back this year, I did cover a little about the fact that I have been in relationships pretty much continuously from around age 14. All the way up to when my former partner of 15 and a half years, who's also the brilliant father of my daughter, we began our separation back in late 2022. So right the way up from age 14 until my early 40s, I have spent my life in relationships. And I felt that it was appropriate to explore this pattern some more now that I am in the midst of what I can only describe as being this heartbreak recovery. post-it not working out with the Gosling guy, who, for anyone new to the show, is the guy that I'm making reference to as having thought he was the one in the opening show intro. So today's revelation is that I now realise, and it is a revelation that has come to me somewhat recently, that my desire and need, it feels like a need, it's something I'm working on, but it feels like a need to be in a relationship, has very much been rooted in what stemmed from being an absolute need, and this is a solid need, to escape, and in many ways to seek protection. So growing up, my family environment was chaotic. It was marked by episodes of domestic abuse, alcoholism, steroid abuse, narcissism, coupled with a lot of emotional immaturity. My father also had extramarital affairs, and this, coupled with steroid abuse in pursuit of bodybuilding accolades, fueled very violent arguments and a very unstable home life. And there was alcohol involved that also added to the volatility. And this is going back to a time that I was very young. In thinking about it, I was probably around 7 or 8. I mean, certainly 8 when my parents started their first round of separation and divorce proceedings. But the point with all of this is, having had that home experience, for me, having a boyfriend became a sanctuary. It was a way that I had somewhere to go in order to escape the toxicity at home. And as a teenager, and in fact, I think going back further than a teenager, perhaps before even starting high school, rather than nurturing friendships, I prioritised having a boyfriend. Because unlike friendships can come in, they can come out, you can have your best friend and then you have a new best friend. At least that was my experience. I was a bit of a pinball as a kid. I didn't have one central group. I would just kind of bounce around all of the different groups and all of the different pockets, and I was kind of everybody's friend but nobody's best friend. And so I found that having a boyfriend could guarantee me as having somewhere else to go. And not only somewhere else to go, but a new family to sort of adopt myself into, and a space that I could go to that would often, very often, depict and reflect the kind of family life that I very much wanted to have, which would be a lot less volatile, a lot more calm, a lot more traditional. And I certainly had that with some of my really good primary school friends. I used to love going to their houses because their homes were just so calm and so traditional, and they would have family meals together and it would just be peaceful. And so I would actively seek out, I don't know that it was active at the time, but I think reflecting back on it, I would actively want to have a boyfriend so that I could go somewhere else and I could adopt myself into somebody else's family. And that's not to say that I didn't have relatives that lived close by. I absolutely did. But unfortunately, again, there was quite a lot of toxicity in those environments. And furthermore, in those environments, my family could still have access to me. So having somewhere else to go was very important. And I vividly remember occasions when I had split up with my high school childhood sweetheart boyfriend. I would, rather than going directly back home, I would actually wander the streets, or I'd go to the park after school, or I'd again adopt myself into friends' families for a while. And I was quite literally always either adopting myself off into other people's families, actually calling some of my friends' parents mum and dad, which bizarrely didn't appear to freak anybody out. I mean, at least outwardly, they just kind of went with it. Or if I wasn't doing that, I went through a phase when I just started high school. I so desperately wanted to go to a different high school from the one that I was sent to, because I had always done dancing and music and performance, and I very much wanted to go to a high school that had a clearer focus on performing arts. And also the high school that I went to was renowned for being a very tough rough high school to the extent that it was actually closed down in the early 2000s. But if I wasn't adopting myself into other people's families, I used to impersonate my mum on the telephone, and I would get the stage newspaper, and I would call around either boarding schools or performing arts schools that were advertising in the stage newspaper to get them to send through prospectuses. And the whole effort of that was so that I could go away. And I used to really implore my parents as to, well, how can we figure out how to send me away, because I so desperately wanted to be somewhere else. So despite those best efforts to convince my parents to send me somewhere else, tragically for me, it never happened. And so over time, my identity became very much one that sought to find a boyfriend, find a relationship, be in a relationship where I could have a degree of freedom from the chaos of my family life. I was also, and I think I might have shared this on the first seasons of the podcast, I was actually engaged at 16 to a slightly older guy who I am incredibly grateful for, actually, because I attribute him not only saving me from a lot of the toxicity that there was in my home at that time, and to depict again, I had recently returned back home, having run away and lived away for several months in the high rises in my local town. And so when I met him, he became a very safe and nurturing space. I was 15 when I met him, and 16, on my 16th birthday, he proposed to me and asked me to marry him. And I was absolutely over the moon at that prospect, because it would mean that I would belong to somebody else and I could go and have this peaceful life with him, who he was a carpenter, he was a joiner, so he was very calm and very stable. And, you know, I do attribute a lot of what I'm doing today as coming from the influence that he was able to provide for me, because he was slightly older. He had a very stable and loving family. They actually got me back into dancing again, and it was thanks to his mum that I returned to dance again and I started competing in dance again. And also thanks to his very loving and calming influence and support, I absolutely smashed my GCSEs, and I went on to college to go and study for A-levels, despite having missed heaps of school when I'd run away from home. So prior to being with him, there was a lot of chaos, and then actually getting with him, it was a lot calmer. The relationship didn't pan out because, of course, I went to college and I wanted to explore the world a little bit more. But the cycle that had begun there as a younger person, this cycle of constantly being in relationships, led to a pattern where I became very codependent and very much outsourcing parts of myself to the other person, to the boyfriend, because even to the extent of things that I didn't drive for, very, very many years. I didn't actually learn to drive until my late 30s. I started learning to drive in my 20s, but I never actually pursued it until my late 30s, after I'd had my daughter, on the basis that I would always have a boyfriend that could drive me around. And so that cycle of codependency, but also self-compromise, because again, when you're in relationship with somebody, there has to be an element of compromise. You need to, in some ways, and this is maybe only my experience, and perhaps in healthier relationships this isn't the case, but in my own experience, you almost have to compact off parts of yourself to be in relationship with another person. And there will, of course, be things that you want to do that you might not necessarily get to do because you're compromising yourself for the other person. And so I would absolutely do that. I would diminish myself in many ways. I would alter parts of myself to fit in not just to the partnership, but also what came with it, which would typically be an extended family, a social group, and in the most part, in my previous relationships, I've always had a fantastic relationship with the family of my boyfriend. Regrettably, with my former partner of 15 and a half years, the ironic thing is that my relationship with his family was always very strained from the outset. But the point is, when we're in relationship, dependent on what that relationship looks and feels like, and dependent on what the cultural environment is, we can find ourselves diminishing some of ourselves, and that can be at what I now believe has been fairly significant personal cost. But the psychological insights on childhood trauma and relationships, let's unpack those for a moment, because digging into the psychology behind how our childhood wounds are showing up for us in relationship, the research has shown that children who grow up in abusive or unstable environments often develop attachment issues that carry through with them into childhood. And that's not to say that you have had an abusive family home, or that it needed to have been unstable throughout. Even periods of instability in our childhood can impact us negatively if our caregivers don't have the space or the tools or the comprehension or even the will or desire to help us navigate through that. Because of course, as children, our brains are not fully developed and we don't have the inner resources ourselves, and it is very much for our caregivers to help us navigate that. So if we don't have that, even a brief moment of instability or change can significantly impact the way in which we feel about that particular experience. And so a psychologist whose name is John Bowlby, he was very much known for his work on attachment theory. And he argued that in our early years, our attachment styles with our caregivers can shape how we relate to others later in life. And so attachment theory, or the idea that early bonds, the bonds that we have with our caregivers, that will go on to play an absolutely crucial role in the functioning of how our relationships play out. And so Bowlby's research on child development has had a really important impact on the way in which we understand human development. And his work to this day continues to influence much of modern day psychology and education and earlier development and care and, of course, parenting. And so Bowlby defined attachment as being this lasting psychological connectedness between human beings. And his theory of attachment suggests that babies have this core primal need to form an attachment bond with their caregiver. And ultimately that's for survival, because an infant, a newborn baby, even a small child, even an older child needs to look to their caregivers and needs to receive from their caregivers everything that they need to have to survive. And so Bowlby went further to argue that a child's earliest attachment with their caregivers actually creates the base level framework, almost the blueprint for all future relationships that child will go on to form. And so this framework, it helps children to understand themselves. It helps children to understand themselves in relation to others, but also their relationship with the world as well. And that in turn goes on to form the foundation for their style of attachment into adulthood. And so that's where it gets interesting, because children and young adults who are exposed to either abuse, neglect, instability, often go on to become adults that develop insecure attachment styles, such as anxious or avoidant attachments. And hello, I'm an anxious attached person. So an anxious attachment style could manifest itself as being this constant need for reassurance, this constant fear of abandonment, or a tendency to stay in unhealthy relationships because of this deep-seated fear of being alone. I feel that description needs to be printed on a t-shirt and I should wear it. Because as Little Miss Anxious over here, I've been blowing up not just relationships, but entire opportunities in my life because of this absolute need for complete reassurance and this absolute fear of being abandoned. And that constant need for reassurance, as I've recently found in my most recent experience of a relationship, is evidently too much for some people to handle, which is great. Yay me. But On the other hand, on the flip side from anxious attachment, we have avoidant attachment style, which is the opposite in attachment style. And that can lead someone to distance themselves emotionally if they're feeling overwhelmed with the feelings and the emotions that they're having, if they're not tuning into them, if they're not able to process them. It can contribute to struggling with intimacy or even avoiding relationships altogether to protect themselves from what they view as being potential pain that might come from opening up their emotions and their heart and their feeling to what they're actually feeling. And so that combination is a brilliant combination, best avoided. It's an excellent pairing, like oil and water being set on fire. And yeah, if those two styles get together, a whole lot of fun can happen. Yeah. So for women in particular who grow up with these unstable, toxic environments, these attachment styles, they can go on to manifest in their dating lives in various ways. Some might seek partners who replicate the dynamics of their early family life. So it can almost be this unconsciously being drawn to what is familiar, even if it's very harmful. And I think that's where we can see where there are patterns of abuse that continue on from one generation to another. That can perhaps be because the adults, the people that have been drawn together, or young adults that have been drawn together, if they have had those abusive relationships and that abusive dynamic in their childhood, and they then repeat the cycle again, that's where we see that kind of that continuation of that toxic cycle. But some, if they're not seeking out the dynamics of their earlier life, others may overcompensate by becoming overly nurturing or self-sacrificing in the hope to receive the love and stability they lacked as children. And I fall into the latter category. I'm a lover girly. I'm an over lover girly. I give and I give and I give and I give and I pour and I pour. And it's like me, love me, please, somebody see me, like me, love me. And it doesn't come from a place of I'm doing it because I'm seeking that. It's so deeply embedded and ingrained into the way that I show up. And it isn't just in romantic relationships. It's in my life. It's probably the reason why I'm a workaholic. It's probably the reason why throughout my career I would be the first in, the last out, the hardest working. Give me more, show me more, do me more. Please acknowledge the fact that I exist and I'm alive. And I think that very much comes from that place. And so again, hence why I'm currently single. For some people, being that lover girly is a bit too much. But let's connect all of these experiences to the psychological theory. So I'm a really big believer in doing the work to understand ourselves and how we're showing up in the world as a result of our trauma. And we're all carrying trauma. We all have it. It can be trauma with a little t, it can be trauma with a big T, but we all have trauma. And not only are we carrying it, but trauma also lives in our bodies. There's a fantastic book that I will link in the show notes called The Body Keeps the Score. And there's a whole host of research into how the trauma and the experiences that we've had are literally stored in our fascia tissue within our bodies. We're carrying it around with us. It's held in our gut. That's why when we're stressed and anxious and overwhelmed, we get a bloated stomach or we put on weight. It's all linked to that trauma. And so I believe that we have to do the work to reflect on our own experiences, to join the dots, to identify the patterns and to work through the trauma, because you can't bury it and you can't pretend that it doesn't exist, particularly when it continues to manifest itself in the world and the life that you're leading and you're having for yourself. So when I reflect on my relationships and when I contemplate what I have previously had up until now as this need to not be single, I can really clearly now see the patterns. It's like the rose-tinted glasses are completely off. And when I think about my earlier relationships, they weren't just about love or companionship. They were deeply rooted in a need for security and escape. And the codependence on my partners provided both a form of liberation, but also an escape from that toxic environment that I had as a younger person. But what it also did is it meant that I was constantly moulding myself to fit into the needs and the desires of my partners, often at the expense of my own self-identity and growth. And I know that I was absolutely doing that in this most recent relationship that I've had. And thankfully, the Gosling guy was very, I believe, gracious in observing that I was very evidently dismissing or abandoning what he perceived as being the needs that I had. And perhaps I didn't realise it myself, or I was trying to sideline them, but they were maybe manifesting in the way that I was behaving. I really need to do a little bit more exploration around that. But what I do know is that the patterns that I have, they're of course continuing on in my adult life. And despite, when I think back on the relationship that I had with my co-parent of 15 and a half years, despite the love that he will always have from me, I'm always going to love that guy. He's the father of my daughter, and I've grown up with him. And, you know, that's something that doesn't, I mean, I could probably hit him half of the time. But, you know, there's always going to be that love and respect there. But he and I were not right for each other. In no way on God's earth were we right for each other. It's miraculous that we even met, frankly. And I do believe, again, and he and I have spoken about this at length, the fact that we were very much trauma bonded over things that had occurred in our early years in our childhood, things that had occurred to us whilst we were developing into adults. And then when we became a couple, we experienced together a number of incredibly destabilizing and difficult life moments that saw our bond being very much formed in trauma. And as a result of that, he and I together sequestered ourselves off from the majority of our wider friendship group, and we went off and we did our own thing, and we moved to Ibiza, and we moved to Manchester, and then we moved to the city centre of Birmingham, and we were very much sequestered off in our own little bubble, and we were completely and utterly codependent on each other as a result. And what we had as a relationship dynamic is there were things that sat with me. I was the breadwinner, I was the main earner, I facilitated our lifestyle, and my co-parent did the rest. You know, a lot of the things around our homes, the maintaining the homes, the housework, the management of bills, all of that sat with him, and I did the generating stuff. I was out generating, working. And so when you have that kind of relationship dynamic where you're outsourcing parts of yourself, it's quite difficult to cycle back from that, even if the relationship is unfulfilling. And towards the end of our relationship, it was incredibly unfulfilling for us both. But because of our codependency, and also by that point in time we had a child together, our desire to have this stable family, nuclear family together, saw us really continuing our relationship for far, far longer than we should have done. And, you know, aided by the fact that in many ways, again, thinking about the sort of the childhood wounds that I have, my desire to not be on my own comes very much from those experiences that I've had at the hands of men, where I've been either hurt or assaulted or attacked or verbally abused or physically abused, and having my co-parent, who, for want of a better expression, can absolutely handle himself, and was really quite the hard knock when we got together. There was a level of safety and security there that I felt very safe. And I felt that if anything were to ever happen, and on occasions that it did, he would stand up for me. And he did on very many occasions. He stood up for me, and he was very secure in ensuring that, you know, I was taken care of and looked after, and that nobody would hurt me, or if they did hurt me, they certainly didn't get away with it. And so I think, considering all of that, but then also, again, doing the reflection piece, which I think is necessary for all of us when we're trying to figure out why things aren't going the way that we want to. When I reflect back on the family dynamic that I had as a teenager, where my mother in her career would be excelling and she would be berated for it. She would be accused of things. She would be held back and restricted, and her freedoms were absolutely curtailed. I think witnessing that, what I had in my co-parent, who wasn't right for me, but he, in stark contrast to that I had experienced in my family home, he 1,000,000,000% supported my career. He supported my growth. He would move cities and countries and probably mountains to follow me and to go with me to wherever it was that I was going in pursuit of my career. And I know from experience with friends and associates and the internet, which is very loud these days, that not everybody has a male partner that provides that level of support and championing and belief. And it takes, in my view, a very, very, very strong man that is very comfortable with their masculinity and very comfortable with who they are, to see their woman, the partner that they're with, be that their wife, be that their girlfriend, to view them excelling and to not feel triggered by that, for their ego not to be wounded by that. That's a really beautifully strong man right there. And again, having experienced firsthand, having witnessed what it is to have a man seek to reduce a woman's ability and talents and capabilities, and to then experience what it's like to have a man that does the opposite of that, I can testify to the fact that it takes a man that's strongly in their masculinity to not want to pull down or reduce another human being. And so I think with all of that, considering all of that, the reason why my 15.5-year relationship was 15.5 years is because I held on to it for too long, and he held on to it for too long, and we held on to each other for too long. And there's a recognition now, as we have continued to individuate and our relationship has moved into almost like a sibling relationship, is probably the closest the closest way that I can articulate how it feels. He's very much like a sibling, and in fact it's probably like that for quite some time before we separated, but that's a conversation for a different day. But the point is that we're now able to unpack together, for the good of our dynamic and our relationship, but also for the good of that we have with our daughter. We're exploring and unpacking quite as to who we are as individuals, because we were so codependent, but also seeking to consider the things that we didn't get right as individuals and a couple, so that we don't carry that into the next relationship that we go into. And that is a big piece of work. But then reflecting more so on this most recent relationship with the Gosling guy and the demise of it, which I'm still processing how sad I am about that. But I believe that the attraction and development of feelings for him came from the fact, actually, conversely, that I have been doing the work on myself. And I have been getting to know myself, and I have been doing the shadow work and the affirmations and reading the psychology books and understanding things about childhood wounds and trauma, enough to the extent that I was finally able to identify the characteristics and the style and the behaviour of a potential partner that I'm actually attracted to. And amusingly, despite his having quite a similar physical aesthetic to my co-parent, because the Lord knows I do love a redhead, the Gosling guy could not have been more different by way of personality and temperament and style and behaviour from my co-parent. And nor could he actually be further away from the kinds of men that I have been attracted to in the past. And I do think that that is as a result of the work that I've done to get to know who I am in the context of me being an individual, which allowed me to identify the qualities in a potential partner. And what I appreciated about the Gosling guy and what I felt attracted to was the fact that he was so peaceful and so calm and so intelligent and measured and well read, and that he had an interest in the world, in politics and global affairs, and he had opinions on things, and he would ask questions and he would respond with fully informed opinions, which I just found absolutely beautiful. And, in many ways, I think the qualities that he displayed, having done the work, obviously not enough, because then he and I would still be together, but to the extent that I'm able to identify those qualities, I am very much aware of the fact that there's a big part of how he is and who he is that represents what little me, little Jade, and adult Jade, frankly, would very much like to have, which is just this peaceful, loving, calm ability to communicate without it becoming this volatile volcano type explosion. But there we go. So in many ways, I think connected to the way that I was raised, which was, largely dismissed. I think there was also another part of that relationship dynamic with the Gosling guy that felt very familiar because of his inability to fully connect into this relationship dynamic. And again, that comes down to we both have our respective lives. They're both very separate. We both have our own child. There's lots of things going on. But he, in his own words, would describe himself as being fairly nonchalant, which I don't know whether that's his character or whether that's just how he was showing up with me. But there was something in that was very, again, this is only analysing in hindsight. I think his inability to fully connect and to fully be present, and the nonchalance and the in and out and the not really being that asked, was very familiar to me, because that's what I'm used to having grown up. Nobody being interested, nobody giving a damn, literally being invisible. Doesn't matter what I do, I'm invisible. I'm second or third or fourth down the pecking order from, firstly, the toxicity of the relationship dynamic that was going on with my parents. But then also, to everything else, it's out of sight, out of mind. I could walk into my parents' house with a Pulitzer Prize, an OBE, a PhD. I could have been to the moon. I could have qualified as an astronaut and been to the moon. I could have founded world peace, and it would still not have any impact whatsoever. There'd be absolutely literal no interest. And so I think with the Gosling guy, I think not at the start, because there was a lot more interest, and there was a lot more interest up until the point that things were going on in his personal life that naturally, I believe, affected his capacity to show up properly and to show up well. But I think the reason why I was so comfortable with waiting around, and particularly with this whole sitting on the back burner thing, the reason why I was so comfortable with doing that is because it's everything that I'm used to. I'm used to being ignored. I'm used to me doing the work to make things happen, or me chasing. I'm used to things not being reciprocated. That is 100% my base level programming. I don't really know anything else. And so the moments that we were together and it was wonderful and lovely were so simple and so peaceful and so wonderful that even when he would disappear, my anxiety would not be directed towards him, it would be directed toward my best mate. So bless Emma, if you're listening. Thank you once again for putting up with all of my blowing up your phone. But look, I mean, the point with all of this is look, the things that have happened to us when we're younger, they're going to keep showing up for us unless we fix them, unless we even identify that they're there. And I think for me, what I need to do now, obviously, is to heal enough so that I'm prepared to even contemplate going back out into the world again. Because right now I feel really raw and really, I'm still in pain. It doesn't feel like the wound is quite as pumping out as it was, but I wouldn't say that the wound has been cauterized yet. It's not healed. And I think that comes down to the fact that the fact is that I've fallen in love with somebody that I'm invisible to. And he didn't choose me. And I think that even as I say that, my stomach flips, because it's that knowing that that is what I've experienced. I've experienced that in my youth, where I wasn't the chosen person for my parents, enough for them to put aside their differences or to decide to separate for the good of their children. Like, I wasn't enough for that, and I wasn't enough to invest in, I wasn't enough to back, I wasn't enough to love fully, I wasn't enough. And I think that feeling of not being enough, and then having that manifest in a relationship that felt really great with somebody that I was incredibly attracted to and I feel a great amount for, and it felt like the universe was like handing me this gift. It was like, look, you've had a really rough couple of years and your long-term relationship has come apart. Look, here's the one for you. And it genuinely felt like that. And to have that not work out because for some reason I'm not enough, that's a wound that needs to be healed, along with the childhood wounds. And for all of us, healing our childhood wounds, it's not a straightforward path, because that programming is so deep rooted. And the healing journey is different for everyone. For me, it involves a lot of introspection, a lot of reading, a lot of listening, a lot of thinking, meditating, crying, screaming, dancing around on the internet, creating a podcast, all the rest of it. But, that's the healing process, and it will be different for everybody. What I am having to learn is to recognise that, what am I seeking out in a relationship? Am I seeking this out of need? Am I seeking this out of fear? Am I seeking this out for validation rather than a genuine connection? I believe that I seek out relationships for a genuine connection. But again, what I will acknowledge is that when I went into the dating world last year, I wasn't ready. I was going into it for some fun, which I think is probably why I didn't show up as my best self for this new relationship with the Gosling guy. I think he got a version of me, and he must have got a version of me that wasn't great. Otherwise, he'd still be with me, because I'm pretty cool. Anyway, wherever you are in your therapist journey, in your healing journey, therapists and psychologists, they often recommend several strategies for individuals who are recognizing patterns like this in themselves. So cognitive behavioral therapy is one, so CBT, that can help in identifying and changing unhealthy thought patterns. There's something called dialectical behaviour therapy. I hadn't heard of that one before this research, but that's another approach that can assist in helping to manage intense emotions. And in doing so, that helps to build healthier relationships. There's mindfulness practices, of course, self-compassion exercises. These can all be very powerful in reconnecting with ourselves and healing our past wounds. Ultimately, understanding how our childhood wounds are showing up for us and what they're doing to, on some occasions, sabotage us, how they are affecting our adult relationships. All of that is a really crucial step towards breaking down unhealthy patterns and building healthier, more fulfilling connections. Because if, like me, you found yourself in a cycle of codependent relationships or struggling to break free from past traumas, I want you to know that you're not alone. You're definitely not alone. And there's so many resources out there now, which is fantastic. And you only have to type in a term into TikTok, and there's just all of these creators that have all of this wisdom and knowledge. And so whatever it is that you're looking to do to try and heal yourself, you don't have to spend a huge amount of money. You don't have to go off and pay for expensive therapists. You can do the work to find the answers. And I will always advocate for speaking with people as well, but also opening up and being vulnerable, a little bit like I am on this podcast, with sharing the things that you're experiencing. That in itself can help you, and it can also help others. So on that note, thanks for listening to another episode of the Single Era Diaries Rebooted. I hope that sharing my story, but also the psychological insights around it, will help you to reflect on your own experiences and your own relationships. And what I will always say is remember that healing, it is a journey, but it is possible. And with all of that, you, I, all of us, we all deserve those loving relationships that honour and respect the whole of who we are. And in doing the work to identify who we are and all of the wounds that come with it, that opens us up to even more beautiful, loving opportunities. So until next week, peace out. That's a wrap for this week's episode. The Single Era Diaries Rebooted is an original presentation of Lace Up Media. And if you like this one, which I hope you did, then remember to follow and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, but also on our YouTube and social media channels. Remember, besties, stay single, stay safe, and peace out.